Almost 10 years ago, she disappeared without a trace, leaving him shattered. Today, he finds her on the streets, broken, desperate, and with 4 boys who look just like him. What happened to her? And what secrets is she hiding? Nolan Lawrence stood in the sleek glass confines of his penthouse office, gazing at the endless Manhattan skyline. The city hummed with life and purpose, its energy contrasting starkly with the void that consumed him. On paper, he was the quintessential success story, a self-made multi-millionaire at the helm of a luxury goods empire, celebrated for his charisma and sharp business acumen. But behind the polished facade and tailored suits was a man haunted by a ghost, a woman who had once been his everything, Jenny. Jenny had disappeared from his life 9 years ago, leaving only a cryptic note that offered no real answers. Nolan had scoured every corner of the city, hired the finest investigators, and delved into places most men of his stature would never tread. Yet, with each passing year, the trail grew colder. Her laughter, her drive, and the light in her eyes when she spoke of their shared dreams had become agonizingly distant memories. No amount of wealth could mend the hollow ache she left behind. On this particular afternoon, as Nolan stepped out of his polished black limousine onto the crowded sidewalks of Midtown, the city's vibrant chaos felt routine, until his world shifted. Amid the noise and movement, his gaze locked on a woman seated on the pavement. Her disheveled appearance spoke of hardship. She was clutching 4 young boys tightly, shielding them as if the world itself were a threat. When she looked up, their eyes met. Time seemed to freeze. It was her, Jenny. Nolan's breath hitched as recognition hit like a blow to the chest. The vibrant woman he remembered had been replaced by someone life had battered. Her hair was unkempt, her face etched with lines of struggle, and her clothes were tattered, but her eyes, they hadn't changed. They still carried the fire he once knew, though dimmed by years of hardship. And the boys at her side? They were the spitting image of him. As he stepped closer, the din of the city faded to nothing. "Jenny," he murmured, his voice trembling. Her expression shifted, recognition mixing with fear. She instinctively drew the boys closer, their small bodies pressing against her protectively. Nolan crouched beside her, his towering frame a mixture of familiarity and uncertainty. "It's me, Nolan," he said softly, his words heavy with emotion. Jenny's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She darted nervous glances around the street, her fear palpable. Sensing her distress, Nolan motioned to his driver, who helped guide Jenny and the children into the limousine. Though hesitant, she allowed herself to be ushered into the car. The ride to Nolan's home was steeped in silence, broken only by the quiet murmurs of the boys. Nolan stole glances at Jenny, struggling to reconcile the broken woman before him with the vibrant one he had loved. Arriving at his sprawling estate, Nolan led Jenny and the boys into a sitting room bathed in warm light. The plush surroundings contrasted sharply with the worn edges of Jenny's being. "Start from the beginning," he urged gently, his voice steady despite the storm of questions brewing inside him. Jenny sat stiffly in an oversized armchair, her fingers twisting the hem of her coat. The boys huddled on a thick rug, their wide eyes darting between Nolan and their mother. Their resemblance to Nolan was undeniable, yet it seemed unfathomable. "Where have you been, Jenny?" he asked, his voice low but laden with emotion. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come to me?" His questions came in a torrent, each one laced with the anguish of years spent wondering. Jenny's gaze dropped to her lap, her hands trembling as she searched for the words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't want to leave, Nolan," she said, her tone raw with vulnerability. "But I had no choice." Nolan's chest tightened at her admission. "No Choice? He echoed, his voice breaking slightly. She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the boys as though weighing how much of her burden she could safely reveal. The weight of her silence was suffocating. Nolan wanted answers, but more than that, he wanted to understand. The golden light of the setting sun spilled through the windows, bathing the room in a soft glow as Jenny prepared to tell her story. Whatever truths she had carried alone for all these years were about to surface, and Nolan braced himself for what would come next. What could be so threatening, so overwhelming, that it forced her to abandon the life they had built together? Jenny inhaled shakily, lifting her eyes to meet him. "It was Jason," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your uncle. He threatened me, Nolan. He said if I didn't leave, he'd make sure neither of us survived." The air seemed to grow colder as the weight of her words settled over them. Jason Lawrence, Nolan's uncle, had always been an ambitious and cunning presence in the family, but this revelation cast him in an even darker shadow. Nolan's jaw clenched, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Jason," he repeated, the name sharp and bitter on his tongue. "What did he want? Why would he target you?" Jenny raised a hand, her expression somber, as if she had rehearsed this painful conversation countless times. "When I found out I was pregnant, Nolan, it felt like the happiest moment of my life," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of the memory. "But Jason didn't see it that way. He saw it as a threat. He was convinced that if I had your children, they'd inherit the company's legacy and take away his control." Her gaze shifted to the boys, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "So I ran. I thought that by staying away, he wouldn't come after you or the babies. I thought I was protecting all of you." Nolan's fists tightened at his sides as her words sank in, each one hitting like a sharp blow. The betrayal was staggering. His own uncle had engineered this nightmare, driven by greed and an insatiable hunger for power. And Jenny. She had endured so much alone, sacrificing everything to keep their family safe. A wave of guilt swept over Nolan. How had he been blind to Jason's machinations? How had he failed to see the cracks forming beneath the surface? The boys shifted uneasily, the tension in the room palpable. Noticing their discomfort, Nolan forced himself to soften. He crouched to their level, offering a gentle smile. "Hey," he said quietly, addressing them for the first time. "I'm Nolan. I know all of this must feel strange, but I promise, you're safe here." The boys exchanged wary glances before the eldest, Alex, stepped forward cautiously. His eyes, so strikingly similar to Nolan's, held a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Are you our dad?" Alex's question landed with the weight of a thunderclap. Nolan's breath caught as he grappled with the enormity of the moment. Slowly, he nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alex, I'm your dad." The words, though surreal, became undeniably real as they left his lips. Alex studied him for a moment before retreating back to his brothers, who huddled closer together. Jenny broke the silence, her voice tinged with apology. "They're not used to strangers," she explained, glancing at the boys. "Life hasn't been kind to us, Nolan. They've had to learn to be cautious." Her words carried a sorrow that pierced through Nolan's heart. Resolving to make up for lost time, he vowed silently to fight for Jenny, for the boys, and for the family he hadn't known existed until now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the room dimmed, but the weight of unresolved questions lingered. Nolan turned to Jenny, his resolve hardening. "You're not alone anymore," he said firmly. Jason won't touch you or the boys. Not ever again. I'll make sure of it. The promise hung in the air, a fragile beacon of hope amidst the wreckage of their shared past. Yet, as Nolan gazed into Jenny's weary eyes, he knew this battle was far from over. It would demand more than promises. It would take strength, strategy, and an unwavering determination. Hours later, the tension in the mansion remained heavy. Nolan stood in his study, staring out at the glittering Manhattan skyline, the chaos within him a stark contrast to the city's serenity. For years, he had prided himself on maintaining control, but this revelation had exposed a blind spot he never saw coming: his own family. Jenny appeared in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm hallway light. She looked fragile, like a bird ready to flee at the slightest sound. "I should have told you sooner," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of regret. "But every time I thought about coming back, I convinced myself it was safer to stay away. I was scared, Nolan. Scared of Jason. Scared of what he'd do to you if he found out." Nolan turned to her, his expression a mix of pain and anger. "You don't need to explain yourself, Jenny," he said, his voice firm. "Jason's actions are on him, and I'll deal with that. But what I can't understand is my mother." He stopped, his voice faltering. "Did she know? Did she help him?" Jenny hesitated, her silence answering more than words could. Finally, she nodded. "Helen thought she was protecting you," she admitted, her voice laced with bitterness. "Jason fed her lies, and she believed him. She thought she was doing what was best for you." The betrayal from his mother cut deeper than Nolan cared to admit. His voice hardened. "We'll deal with them both," he said. "But for now, we need to focus on you and the boys. They've been through enough. I won't let anyone hurt them again." In the guest wing, the four boys cautiously explored their new surroundings. Alex, ever the protector, kept an eye on his younger brothers, Caleb, Liam, and Noah. The grandeur of their new environment was overwhelming, a stark contrast to their previous life. Caleb ran his fingers along a smooth marble countertop, whispering, "Do you think we'll stay here?" Alex shrugged, feigning indifference. "I don't know," he replied, "but Mom trusts him. Maybe we can too." His words carried a measured tone, but deep down, a spark of belief flickered. Maybe, just maybe, this time, it was real. For as long as he could recall, their lives had been dominated by fear and instability. The concept of security, of having a real home, felt like an impossible dream. In the quiet of his study, Nolan reached for his phone, dialing a number that had remained untouched for years. When the call connected, a deep, no-nonsense voice answered. "Lawrence," the man said simply. It was Kurt, his trusted fixer. Nolan skipped the formalities. "I need you to dig into Jason Lawrence. Everything. His dealings, his connections, and anything illegal he's tied to." There was a pause on the other end before Kurt replied, his tone laced with caution. "This could get ugly. Are you sure you're ready to go there?" Nolan's jaw tightened as he stared at the dark wood grain of his desk. "I'm not just opening this door, Kurt. I'm ripping it off its hinges. Jason crossed a line, and I'm making sure he can't hurt anyone again." Kurt didn't argue. After exchanging the necessary details, Nolan ended the call and turned to find Jenny watching him closely, her face a mixture of worry and curiosity. "What are you planning?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Nolan met her gaze, his determination unyielding. "I'm taking everything Jason has used against us and turning it back on him. His empire is built on lies and manipulation, and it ends now. I don't care what it takes. He's going to pay for everything he's done." Jenny's expression softened, a hint of resolve creeping into her eyes. For the first time in years, the thought of standing up to the forces that had chased her into fear and hiding seemed like more than just a fantasy. It was terrifying, but also freeing. "We'll face this together," she said quietly, her voice firm despite the trembling of her hands. But in the shadowed hallway just outside the study, Helen Lawrence stood frozen, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She had heard enough to know her son was piecing things together, unraveling the delicate web she had spent years spinning. Her heart ached with the weight of her decisions. She had convinced herself it was all done out of love, protecting her family, safeguarding their future. But now, with the cracks in her carefully crafted facade beginning to show, Helen realized that love alone wouldn't shield her from the storm Nolan was about to unleash. The next morning, sunlight poured through the towering windows of Nolan's mansion, bathing the marble floors in a warm, golden glow. Despite the serene scene, tension hung in the air. Nolan sat at the head of the dining table, his coffee untouched. Across from him, Jenny held a cup of tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around it, as if seeking its warmth for reassurance. The boys' laughter echoed faintly from the hallway, the only sound cutting through the silence. The stillness broke as Nolan's phone vibrated on the polished table. He picked it up and saw Carter's name on the screen, his best investigator. Rising from his chair, Nolan stepped toward the window before answering. "What do you have?" he asked, his tone calm, but edged with anticipation. Carter's response was concise. "A lot. Jason's knee-deep in embezzlement, bribery, and dealings with some dangerous people. But there's more." Nolan's grip tightened on the phone. "What else?" Carter hesitated before continuing. "Your mother, her role in all of this. It's bigger than you think. She didn't just get pressured by Jason. She was actively working with him. There's evidence she helped push Jenny out of your life. Documents, recordings, enough to prove it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was intentional." The weight of Carter's words hit Nolan like a freight train. His mother, a part of the betrayal. His jaw clenched as anger burned in his chest. "Send me everything," he said, his voice cold and controlled. When he returned to the table, Jenny's eyes followed him, concern etched on her face. "That call, it was about Jason, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. Nolan nodded grimly. "And my mother," he added bitterly. Jenny reached out, her hand brushing against his. "Nolan," she said softly, her tone pleading, "whatever you're planning, don't let it destroy you. The boys need you. I need you. Don't lose yourself in this." Her words gave him pause, but his resolve remained firm. "I won't let them get away with it," he replied. "They've already taken too much. It's time they face the consequences." Jenny sighed, her worry deepening, but she knew Nolan well enough to see he wouldn't back down. She could only hope the battle ahead wouldn't consume him. Meanwhile, in the playroom, Alex sat apart from his brothers, his thoughts heavy. He had overheard fragments of the adults' conversation, piecing together more than they realized. Caleb and Liam were engrossed in building with blocks, while Noah quietly sketched with crayons. Alex's protective instincts kicked in. Whatever was happening, he trusted his mother to handle it, though he wasn't sure yet if Nolan deserved that same trust. For now, he decided to keep what he knew to himself. Later that day, Nolan's office turned into the command center of his personal war. Carter's package arrived, exposing Jason's intricate web of deceit. Nolan examined the documents, his focus unyielding, but one particular photograph stopped him cold, a blurry image of Jenny entering a shelter with the boys. Her face, etched with fear and desperation, pierced through him. The weight of all she'd endured without him made his hands tremble as he clutched the evidence. As night descended, Helen Lawrence stood hesitantly at the grand entrance of Nolan's home. Her usual composed demeanor was replaced by uncertainty as she raised her hand to knock. She knew she had to face her son before he unraveled the entirety of her involvement. The door swung open and Nolan's piercing stare met her. "Mother," he said, his voice flat and void of emotion, "what brings you here?" Helen stepped inside, the sound of her heels echoing on the marble floor. "Nolan, we need to talk," she started, but he cut her off with a sharp edge to his tone. "About what, exactly? How do you scheme with Jason to destroy my life? How did you decide Jenny wasn't good enough for me?" His words struck like daggers, and Helen flinched, unused to such candor from her son. "I did what I thought was best," she said defensively, her voice faltering. "You were young, impulsive. Jenny didn't fit the future I envisioned for you." Nolan let out a bitter laugh. "The future you envisioned? The one where I was left isolated, miserable, and manipulated by Jason? You didn't protect me, Mother. You stripped away the only thing that gave my life meaning." His voice softened slightly, though the disappointment remained evident. "But this isn't just about me anymore. It's about the boys, your grandsons. They deserve a life free from lies and betrayal." Helen's composure cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I only wanted to keep you safe," she whispered. Nolan shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and resolve. "You didn't protect me. You failed me." Helen left, her guilt weighing her down like a stone. Nolan, still simmering with anger, felt a small sense of triumph. It was the first step in unraveling the lies that had consumed his life, but he knew the fight was far from over. Jason would not go down without a fight, and Nolan needed every ounce of strength to safeguard the family he was determined to rebuild. Morning dawned over the Lawrence estate, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, but the serenity outside offered no solace for the storm brewing within. Nolan had spent a restless night, poring over Carter's files and piecing together Jason's schemes and his mother's role in Jenny's disappearance. The weight of it all pressed on him, but retreat was not an option. This was no longer just about retribution. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him and securing a future for Jenny and their children. In the kitchen, Jenny busied herself with breakfast, the familiar rhythm of chopping vegetables offering a momentary sense of normalcy. The boys sat at the table, their giggles and playful chatter filling the air. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the family life she had always dreamed of. But her peace shattered when Nolan entered, his face grim and determined. "We need to talk," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Jenny set down her knife, wiping her hands on a towel, and led him to the sitting room. Nolan handed her a thick folder, its weight almost symbolic of the truth it held. "This is everything Carter found," he began. "Jason's crimes, my mother's betrayal. It's all here." Jenny hesitated before opening the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. With every line she read, her breath hitched. He was tracking me," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Even after I left, he kept tabs on me." A chill ran down her spine. She had thought leaving Nolan was the only way to keep him and the boys safe. But Jason had never truly let her go. Nolan reached out, covering her hand with his. "He won't hurt you again," he promised, his voice firm. "But we need to be strategic. Taking Jason down won't be simple. He's smart, and he has people in powerful places protecting him." Jenny met his gaze, her own resolve solidifying. "Then we fight," she said quietly but with conviction, "for our family, for our future." Determined, Nolan began assembling his team. Carter was already on board, but Nolan needed more allies. That afternoon, he met with Claire Donahue, his company's razor-sharp legal advisor. Claire had earned Nolan's trust through years of loyalty and expertise. "This is a disaster," Claire said after reviewing the documents. "If even half of this is accurate, Jason's been laundering money and hiding it behind shell companies. But exposing him won't be a walk in the park. He'll retaliate, and if he feels cornered, he might try to bring you down with him." Nolan's expression hardened. "I don't care what he throws at me. What I won't accept is letting him get away with everything he's done. To me, to Jenny, to my sons. Will you help me?" Claire studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I'll start building a case. But Nolan, brace yourself. This is going to get ugly." Meanwhile, Jenny began finding her own allies, steeling herself for the battle ahead. Together, they knew they would need to fight not just for justice, but for the chance to rebuild the lives Jason had torn apart. As Jenny strolled through the estate's sprawling garden with Alex, she couldn't help but notice the heavy burden he seemed to carry. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested squarely on them. She gently placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "Alex, you don't have to take care of everything on your own," she said, her gaze full of concern. Alex hesitated, glancing up at her, his expression shadowed with doubt. "If I don't, who will?" he replied, his tone somber. Jenny knelt slightly to meet his eyes. "You're not alone anymore," she assured him. "Nolan's here now. So am I. We'll figure this out together." Alex gave a small nod, though the furrow in his brow remained. Jenny understood. After everything they had endured, trust wasn't going to come easily. It had to be rebuilt, piece by piece. Later that evening, Nolan called everyone into the living room for a family meeting. The boys sat close together on the oversized couch, their wide eyes locked on their father as he began to speak. His voice was steady, yet it carried an undeniable warmth. "I need you all to know something," he began. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you or your mom again. I promise you that." His words hung in the air, heavy with conviction. But even as the family began to repair the bonds torn by years of hardship, danger was brewing elsewhere. Across the city, in an opulent office adorned with dark wood paneling and sleek leather furnishings, Jason leaned back in his chair, his face cold and unreadable. Across from him sat Helen, visibly conflicted. "Nolan is making his move," Jason said, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "We can't afford to fall behind." Helen's hand hesitated over the document, her face flickering with guilt. "He's my son, Jason," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. "I've already done enough to hurt him." Jason's lip curled in disdain. "Sentimentality will destroy us, Helen," he snapped, his tone sharp. "If Nolan thinks he can take me down, he's deluded, and if you want any hope of salvaging your relationship with him, you'll do as I say." Helen's heart sank as she rose to leave, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. She knew the path she was on had a steep cost, one she wasn't sure she could pay. Jason's grip on her life was tight, and breaking free would require more strength than she could summon. Back at the Lawrence mansion, a heavy silence settled over the house, the kind that felt unnatural in a home full of people. Nolan sat in his study, papers scattered across the large oak desk. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a deep breath as he pieced together Jason's schemes. The web of lies and manipulation was starting to reveal itself, but there were still gaps, secrets he hadn't yet uncovered. And it wasn't just Jason. The deceit seemed to stretch deeper into his family than he'd dared imagine. Down the hall, Jenny was in the boys' room, sitting beside Alex while his younger brothers slept soundly. Their small forms were nestled under blankets, peaceful in sleep, but Alex was wide awake, his mind teeming with unspoken questions. "Mom," he began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you tell us about him?" "About Dad?" Jenny's chest tightened at his words. She reached for his hand, her own trembling slightly. "I wanted to," she said softly, her voice laced with regret. "I thought keeping you away from him would keep you safe. I thought I was doing the right thing." Alex's brow furrowed, his face etched with the worry of someone far older than his years. "Do you think he can really protect us?" he asked quietly. Jenny took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," she said firmly. "Nolan's a good man, Alex. He didn't know about you, but now that he does, he'll do everything he can to keep us safe." Alex seemed to ponder her words for a long moment before giving a small nod, as if cautiously deciding to trust her. Meanwhile, Nolan was about to uncover a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew. In his study, Nolan opened a file marked "Urgent" that Carter had sent over. His eyes scanned the pages, his breath catching as he absorbed the damning evidence. A series of financial transactions linked Jason to a notorious enforcer, a man infamous for eliminating problems. The dates lined up with the time Jenny had fled. And there, intertwined with Jason's name, was another, Helen Lawrence. Nolan's stomach churned as he realized his mother had not only been aware of Jason's threats, but had actively funded them. The depth of her betrayal sent a cold wave of anger through him. He stormed out of his study, unable to sit still, and found Jenny in the hallway. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern coloring her voice. Without a word, Nolan handed her the file. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low. Jenny's hands trembled as she read the contents. Her face paled, then darkened with anger. "He was tracking us the whole time," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I thought I was protecting the boys, but he was always one step ahead." She looked up at Nolan, her fear replaced by fierce determination. "We have to stop him, Nolan, whatever it takes." Nolan nodded, his jaw set. "We will," he promised. Then, after a pause, he added, "But it's not just Jason. My mother, she's part of this too." Jenny had thrown her support behind Jason's plans, and that betrayal still stung. Could Nolan ever forgive her for it? He wasn't sure. As if sensing his turmoil, Jenny reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You don't have to decide that right now," she said softly. "Let's focus on Jason first. The rest, we'll figure it out when the time comes." The hours stretched into the night as Nolan and Jenny huddled together, sketching out their next moves. They knew they needed an ally, and they turned to Claire, whose sharp intellect and legal expertise could be the key to dismantling Jason's grip on the company. On a late-night call, Claire's voice was steady but cautious. "We have to play this smart," she warned. "Jason won't go down easily. If he feels cornered, he'll retaliate. We need to stay a step ahead of him." Across town, Jason was already plotting his response. In his dimly lit office, surrounded by shadows and two men whose cold demeanor radiated menace, he leaned back in his chair with a smug smile. "Nolan thinks he's clever," Jason sneered, "but I know exactly how he'll come at me. Through the board, through the courts, he's predictable. We'll make sure that doesn't happen." One of the men gave a curt nod, his voice as sharp as the edge of a blade. "Consider it handled." But Jason wasn't satisfied with just safeguarding his empire. He wanted Nolan crushed. He knew Nolan's Achilles heel wasn't wealth or influence, it was his family. And Jason had no problem exploiting that weakness to destroy him completely. Back at the Lawrence estate, Helen stood silently in the hallway, her ears catching fragments of Nolan and Jenny's tense conversation. Guilt gnawed at her. She had made mistakes, ones that had driven a wedge between her and her son. Yet as she turned away from the sound of their voices, she made a decision. It might be too late for forgiveness, but she could still confront Jason. Perhaps she could set things right, even if it came at a cost. When dawn broke, the battle lines were drawn, secrets had been exposed, alliances were formed, and the stakes had climbed to unimaginable heights. Nolan braced himself for the storm ahead, determined to protect the people he cared about most. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the estate, bathing the sprawling grounds in soft golden light. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. In his study, Nolan sat hunched over his desk, surrounded by files and his open laptop. Across from him, Claire paced, scanning the documents Carter had unearthed. "This is enough to bring Jason down," she said, her voice steady but edged with caution. "But it's a gamble. If Jason catches wind of what we're doing, he could destroy the evidence, or worse." Nolan's jaw tightened. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly. "Every day we wait is another day he could hurt Jenny or the boys. I won't let that happen." His words carried conviction, but Claire caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her tone gentler. "We'll get through this, Nolan. But this isn't just about taking Jason down. It's about keeping your family safe, even if it means making sacrifices." In the guest wing, Jenny sat with the boys, her arms around them as they played quietly on the carpet. Alex, the eldest, studied her intently. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" he asked, his voice small but serious. Jenny managed a smile and smoothed his hair. "No, sweetheart," she assured him. "Your dad is handling everything. We'll be okay." But the uncertainty lingered, a weight she couldn't shake. Meanwhile, Helen entered Nolan's study, her posture firm but hesitant. Nolan glanced up, his expression cold. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Helen hesitated, but her voice was steady. "I'm here to make things right. I know I've hurt you, Nolan, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I can't stand by while Jason destroys you, or this family." Nolan leaned back, skepticism evident in his eyes. "And what exactly do you plan to do to help?" Helen reached into her handbag and pulled out a worn folder, placing it on the desk between them. "These are Jason's private ledgers," she explained. "I kept them as leverage, but now I realize they belong in your hands. They document every bribe, every illegal deal he's made over the years." Nolan opened the folder, his eyes scanning the damning evidence inside. His breath caught as the magnitude of what he held sank in. "Why now?" he asked, his voice softer than before, a hint of curiosity breaking through his guarded tone. Helen's eyes met his, filled with a mix of guilt and determination. "Because it's time someone stood up to him." Helen's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I've already lost too much," she confessed, her voice heavy with emotion. "I can't bear the thought of losing you too." Before Nolan could respond, a sudden commotion broke the quiet atmosphere. Carter barged in, his usual calm replaced by urgency. "We've got an issue," he announced, his tone brisk. "Jason knows. He's already moving assets and covering his tracks. If we don't act now, we'll lose any chance to stop him." Nolan's demeanor shifted instantly, his focus razor-sharp. "Contact the board members," he directed Carter and Claire, his voice firm. "I want an emergency meeting within the hour." "Jason thinks he can outmaneuver me," Nolan added, a glint of determination in his eyes. "He's about to find out just how wrong he is." Claire nodded, her fingers already dialing numbers, as she left the room. While Nolan prepared for the confrontation ahead, Jason was busy making his own moves. In his modern downtown office, he leaned back in his chair with a self-assured smirk. His informant's updates spread across his desk. "Nolan's predictable," Jason remarked, his voice dripping with confidence. "He'll come straight at me, thinking he's in control. Let him. By the time he figures out the game has changed, it'll already be over." But Jason's confidence faltered when his assistant entered the room, her expression pale and uncertain. "Sir, there's a problem," she said cautiously. "The board has called an emergency meeting. They're reviewing evidence of financial misconduct." The smirk disappeared from Jason's face, replaced with a dark scowl. "Find out who's responsible for this," he snapped, his voice sharp with irritation, "and get ready for damage control. If Nolan thinks he can win this, he's got another thing coming." Back at Nolan's estate, Jenny found him in the study, his focus unrelenting. "What's going on?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Nolan looked up, his features softening for a brief moment. "It's time," he said simply. "Jason is finally going to face the consequences of everything he's done." Jenny stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm. "Be careful," she urged, her eyes filled with worry. "He's dangerous." "So am I," Nolan replied, his tone steady, "especially when it comes to protecting the people I care about." The boardroom was electric with tension as Nolan methodically presented his case. Piece by piece, he unveiled the evidence against Jason: fraudulent transactions, falsified reports, and damning accounts from witnesses. The room buzzed as every detail was laid bare. Across the table, Jason maintained an air of defiance, though his eyes betrayed simmering fury. "This is a baseless attack," Jason retorted, his voice sharp. "You don't have any real proof." Claire stepped forward, her calm and composed presence a stark contrast to Jason's bluster. "The proof is right here," she said, holding up ledgers and documents Helen had uncovered. "And there's more. Audits, testimony, all pointing to your misconduct. There's nowhere left to hide, Mr. Lawrence." The tension peaked as Helen entered the room, her expression firm and resolute. "It's over, Jason," she declared, her voice steady. "I've stood by you for too long, but I can't anymore. Nolan is right. You've caused this family enough harm." Jason's composure cracked, and for a brief moment he was at a loss for words. The board's decision came swiftly and unanimously. Jason was stripped of his position, and a full investigation into his actions was launched. Nolan had won, but Jason's parting words lingered in the air like a dark cloud. "This isn't the end, Nolan," Jason warned, his smile cold and unsettling. "You've made an enemy you can't afford." That evening, Nolan returned home, exhausted but resolute. Jenny greeted him at the door with a soft smile, wrapping her arms around him in a comforting embrace. "It's done," he said quietly. "Jason's out." But even as he held her close, unease gnawed at him. Jason's threat felt far from empty, and Nolan knew the battle was only beginning. The days following Jason's ousting were chaotic. Nolan's victory had shifted the dynamics of his company and his family, drawing intense scrutiny from the public, the board, and the authorities. Though he had no regrets, he knew the challenges ahead would test his resolve. At home, the atmosphere was fragile but hopeful. The boys were slowly adapting to their new lives. Alex, the eldest, had taken on the role of protector for his brothers, his cautious nature beginning to soften as he grew to trust Nolan. Caleb and Liam filled the estate with laughter and curiosity, exploring every corner. Noah, the youngest, remained close to Jenny, his quiet demeanor a poignant reminder of the struggles they had endured. Nolan often watched from a distance, his heart a mixture of pride and sorrow for the moments he had missed. Determined to bridge the gap, he joined the boys in the garden one evening, a soccer ball tucked under his arm. "Who's up for a game?" he asked, his tone warm. The boys exchanged hesitant looks before Alex spoke up. "Do you even know how to play?" he asked skeptically. Nolan chuckled, his smile genuine. "You might be surprised." That evening marked a turning point. As the boys laughed and played, Nolan felt the walls between them begin to crumble. For the first time, he caught a glimpse of the family they could become. But the fleeting peace was shattered the next morning when Claire called. Her tone was serious, her words precise. "We've got a problem," she said. Jason's legal team was fighting back hard. They'd just filed a countersuit, claiming that Nolan had orchestrated Jason's removal for personal reasons and fabricated the evidence to support it. Nolan's fingers tightened around the phone. "What's their game plan?" he asked sharply. Claire let out a tired sigh. "They're trying to discredit the investigation, make it look illegitimate. If they pull it off, it could undo everything we've worked for, and worse, it might even jeopardize the company's future." Nolan's jaw set in frustration. Jason's vendetta was as relentless as ever, and the threat he posed had only grown more dangerous. "Do whatever it takes to shut this down," Nolan said, his tone firm and unyielding. Claire hesitated, then replied, "I agree, but this won't be an easy fight. We have a long road ahead." While Nolan dealt with Jason's latest schemes, Jenny faced battles of her own. The media had caught wind of her reappearance, and the frenzy was suffocating. Headlines swung between portraying her as a mysterious heroine and accusing her of being a gold digger chasing Nolan's fortune. The relentless scrutiny weighed heavily on her, but her greatest concern was for the boys. One afternoon, as Jenny strolled through the estate's garden, Helen approached her. The older woman, usually so composed and aloof, seemed almost vulnerable. "Jenny?" Helen began, her voice uncharacteristically tentative. "I wanted to say thank you." Jenny stopped, caught off guard. "Thank me? For what?" Helen's gaze shifted to the ground, guilt clouding her face. "For giving me another chance. I don't deserve it, but I want to be a part of your lives. Your life and the boys, if you'll allow it." Jenny studied her for a long moment, torn between lingering resentment and the sincerity in Helen's words. Finally, she replied, "It's not me you need to convince. It's Nolan and the boys." Helen nodded, her expression filled with understanding. She knew rebuilding trust would take time, but for the first time in years, she was willing to make the effort. As the family worked toward a fragile stability, Jason escalated his attacks. He began leaking sensitive company information to the media, painting Nolan as a ruthless businessman who cared only for power and profits. The allegations triggered an investigation by regulators, piling more pressure onto an already strained company. Nolan felt the strain acutely. Balancing the chaos at work with his responsibilities at home became an uphill battle. One evening, while he sat in his study, staring at the mountain of problems in front of him, Jenny walked in. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You can't carry this burden alone," she said softly. "Let me help." Nolan looked up, his exhaustion plain to see. "I don't want you dragged into this mess," he admitted. "You've already been through enough." Jenny shook her head firmly. "We're in this together, Nolan. Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a family." Her words were a balm to his weary spirit, giving him the strength to press forward. The next day, Nolan called a press conference to confront the mounting accusations. Standing before a sea of cameras, he spoke with conviction. "The truth will come out," he declared. "My priority has always been the integrity of this company and the well-being of my family." The statement drew mixed reactions, but it sent a clear message. Nolan Lawrence wasn't backing down. When he returned home that evening, the boys were waiting for him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and pride. "Did you win?" Caleb asked, his voice full of hope. Nolan crouched to their level, his eyes steady. "Not yet," he said honestly, "but we're getting closer." The boys nodded, their faith in him unwavering. As Nolan embraced them, he realized that in the ways that truly mattered, he had already won. The Lawrence estate seemed unusually quiet, an almost eerie stillness filling its grand halls. Nolan sat in his study, staring at a stack of documents. Though his press conference had projected confidence, cracks in his resolve were starting to show. Jason's legal maneuvers had thrown the company into turmoil, and the relentless public scrutiny only made matters worse. Every headline, every leak felt like another weight added to the load he carried. Across the estate, Jenny watched the boys play in the garden. While she admired their resilience, she couldn't ignore the shadows of confusion and fear in their eyes. Alex, the eldest, seemed especially withdrawn, his self-imposed role as protector taking a toll. Jenny resolved to speak with Nolan about how they could help him navigate the emotional storm surrounding them. Nolan's thoughts were interrupted by a call from Claire. Her voice was sharp, edged with urgency. "Nolan, you need to see this," she said, forwarding a file to his email. Nolan opened the attachment, scanning it quickly. It was a report detailing offshore accounts linked to Jason, but one detail on the final page made his stomach drop. A financial connection leading directly back to Helen. Betrayal washed over him once more, sharp and stinging. Nolan never imagined how deeply entangled his mother was in the chaos surrounding his life. Her motives, once seemingly straightforward, were now clouded with layers of deceit. Determined to confront her, he picked up the phone. Helen answered on the second ring, her tone guarded. "I've been expecting your call, Nolan." "Then you must know what I've discovered," he replied coldly, his voice like ice. Helen exhaled audibly, a mix of resignation and nervousness. "I can explain." "Enough with excuses, Mother," Nolan interrupted sharply. "I don't want explanations, I want the truth. All of it." Reluctantly, Helen agreed to meet him in person. By the time she arrived at the estate later that afternoon, the tension between them was so thick it was almost tangible. "I did what I thought was best," Helen began, her voice trembling as she lowered herself onto the chair across from her son. "Jason convinced me that Jenny wasn't right for you. He said she'd destroy your future. I thought I was protecting you, Nolan." Nolan's jaw tightened, his expression hardening. "Protecting me? By financing Jason's schemes? By forcing Jenny out of my life? That wasn't protection. You destroyed everything that mattered to me." His words struck like a hammer, breaking Helen's fragile composure. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stammered, "I see that now. But I swear, Nolan, I didn't know Jason would take things as far as he did. By the time I realized, it was too late." Nolan shook his head, his pain evident. "Too late doesn't erase the damage you caused," he said firmly. "But if you want any chance at redemption, you'll help me put an end to this. Jason's reign has to end." Helen nodded slowly, her face a mixture of guilt and resolve. For the first time in years, Nolan felt a flicker of hope that his mother might help repair what she had helped destroy. Together they began to map out their strategy, knowing that Jason's lies had built an empire, and lies were destined to crumble. Later that evening, Nolan was in the library, poring over files with laser-sharp focus, when Jenny approached. Her soft footsteps barely disturbed the stillness. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You look exhausted," she said, her voice warm but concerned. Nolan looked up, offering her a faint smile. "I am. But we're getting close. Jason's running out of hiding places." Jenny hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's something you should know," she said cautiously. "When I was on the run, I kept a journal. I wrote down everything I could remember. Jason's threats, his associates, anything that might help if I ever had to fight back." Nolan's eyes sparked with interest. "Do you still have it?" Jenny nodded. "It's in one of the boxes I brought with me. I'll find it." Her revelation reignited Nolan's determination. This was no longer just about taking Jason down. It was about reclaiming the life they'd both lost. As the night deepened, Jenny unearthed the journal, its pages worn but full of potential leads. Side by side, they sifted through the entries, piecing together Jason's intricate web of operations. One entry stood out. It described a meeting between Jason and someone referred to only as the broker. The cryptic passage hinted at a deal involving Nolan's company, but the details were vague. Nolan frowned as he reread it. "If we can figure out who this broker is, we might finally have the key to take him down," he said. The next morning, Nolan tasked Carter with identifying the mysterious figure. Meanwhile, he and his family worked to maintain a sense of normalcy for the boys. Their laughter echoed through the halls, a poignant reminder of what was at stake. But Jason wasn't sitting idly by. In his secluded office, he finalized his next move, a calculated smear campaign aimed directly at Nolan. Fabricated documents and false allegations were leaked to the press, painting Nolan as a corrupt, deceitful leader. The scandal sent shockwaves through the media and his company. Yet, instead of buckling under the weight of the accusations, Nolan fought back with a renewed vigor. With Claire, Carter, and even Helen on his side, he began to dismantle Jason's web of lies piece by piece. As the fallout unfolded, Nolan's team gathered in his study. The air in the room was charged with anticipation as they reviewed their final strategy. Every piece of evidence from Jenny's journal, every connection uncovered by Carter, had been meticulously prepared for the ultimate takedown. "Jason's smear campaign is unraveling," Claire reported, gesturing toward the projected documents. "The fabricated evidence he leaked is already falling apart. Once we present our case to the authorities and the board, it's over for him." The tension was palpable, but so was the sense of impending resolution. Nolan looked around at the faces of his allies, Jenny, Helen, Claire, Carter, and felt a quiet resolve. Jason had gone too far, but this was the end game. Nolan would fight not just for his company, but for the family and life he was determined to protect. Carter spoke up, his tone firm and assured. "The broker's identity is confirmed. His name is Vincent Croft, a fixer who specializes in behind-the-scenes dealings. Croft was Jason's go-to guy for laundering money and arranging off-the-books operations. Jason wanted him silenced, but I've arranged a meeting." Nolan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. We need Croft's testimony. If we can get him on our side, it's game over for Jason." Turning to Helen, who had remained quiet up until now, Nolan added, "You said you wanted to make things right. This is your chance. Are you ready?" Helen met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the mansion, Jenny sat with the boys, Alex, Caleb, Liam, and Noah. The children were deeply focused on a board game, their laughter filling the room, a stark contrast to the tension that loomed over the household. But Jenny noticed Alex seemed distracted. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "What's going on, sweetie?" she asked softly. Alex hesitated, then whispered, "Is Dad in danger?" Jenny's heart twisted at the question. "Your dad is very strong," she reassured him. "He's fighting to protect us, and he won't let anything happen to our family." Alex nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. "I believe him," he said quietly. "But I'm scared." Jenny pulled him into a hug, her voice calm and steady. "It's okay to be scared," she said, "but you don't have to face it alone. We're in this together, remember?" Alex smiled faintly, his tense shoulders relaxing as he leaned into her embrace. Back in the study, the team was putting the final touches on their strategy. Nolan was set to confront Jason at the upcoming board meeting, armed with concrete evidence and Croft's testimony. The stakes had never been higher, not just for the company, but for Nolan's family and future. "This is it," Nolan said, his voice calm but resolute. "No more games. Jason doesn't get to control my life or anyone else's anymore." The next day, Nolan arrived at Lawrence Enterprises, the towering headquarters looming ahead. As he entered the boardroom, every eye in the room was fixed on him. Jason sat at the far end of the table, his smug demeanor faltering when Nolan met his gaze. "Let's get started," Nolan said, his tone commanding. Claire began the presentation, laying out the evidence step by step. The room fell silent as she revealed Jason's illegal dealings, each revelation more damning than the last. But the game-changer came when Carter played an audio recording of Vincent Croft. The fixer's gravelly voice filled the room, confirming Jason's involvement in the fraudulent schemes and money laundering. Jason's composure shattered as murmurs rippled through the board members. "This is absurd!" Jason snapped, jumping to his feet. "You think the word of a criminal carries weight here? This is just a desperate attempt to destroy me." Nolan stood, his calm presence a sharp contrast to Jason's outburst. "Desperate?" he echoed, his voice cutting through the tension. "The only desperation here is yours, Jason. For years, you've manipulated this company, our family, and everyone around you for your own benefit. But it all ends today." Helen rose from her seat, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Jason, you've poisoned this family for far too long. I've made my mistakes, but I won't let you drag us down any further. It's over." Jason's face twisted with rage, but before he could respond, Claire handed a folder to the chair of the board. "These documents outline everything you need to proceed with legal action," she said. "We recommend an immediate vote to remove Jason from all positions within the company." The vote was swift and unanimous. Jason was stripped of his title and escorted out by security, his protests echoing in the hallways. As the doors shut behind him, Nolan felt a surge of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't entirely over. Legal proceedings would follow, but Jason's reign of terror was officially over. That evening, Nolan returned home to find Jenny and the boys waiting for him in the living room. "How did it go?" Jenny asked, her eyes searching his face. Nolan smiled, pulling her into his arms. "It's done," he said. "Jason's out." The boys cheered, their excitement filling the room. Alex ran up to Nolan, wrapping his arms around him. "You did it, Dad!" he exclaimed, his voice full of admiration. Nolan hugged him tightly, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. As the family gathered together, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift, and for the first time in a long while, they could breathe easy. Nolan knew that what had just begun was only the start of a new chapter, a chapter where they could finally begin healing and rebuild the life they'd always deserved. The aftermath of Jason's downfall rippled through every facet of Nolan's world. At Lawrence Enterprises, rumors about the scandal spread like wildfire, and the board scrambled to salvage the company's reputation. The media circus was relentless, but Nolan tackled it head-on, making public statements that reaffirmed his commitment to honesty and integrity. With Claire's help, he threw himself into the task of regaining trust within the company, ensuring that Jason's mistakes wouldn't tarnish the empire Nolan had spent years creating. At home, while the weight of recent events still hung in the air, there was a shift. The boys seemed more relaxed, their laughter filling the house again as they adjusted to their new life. But Jenny could tell that Nolan was still carrying the emotional burden of everything that had happened. One quiet evening, as the boys slept soundly and the house was bathed in stillness, she found Nolan in the study, staring at a photograph of his parents. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Jenny asked softly, sitting down beside him. Nolan exhaled deeply, setting the photo aside. "It's hard not to," he confessed. "My mom. She's trying, but I can't forget what she did. Part of me wants to forgive her, but another part—" His voice faltered, and Jenny placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "She's made an effort to make things right," Jenny said gently, "and she stood by us when it counted. Maybe forgiveness doesn't have to happen all at once. Maybe it's something you give in pieces, little by little." Nolan nodded slowly, the weight of her words providing a glimpse of clarity. "You're right," he agreed. "It's just going to take time." Helen, for her part, had been quietly working on mending her relationship with her son and his family. She spent hours with the boys, sharing stories about their father's childhood and teaching them small lessons on resilience. Alex, who had been the most distant, began to warm up, his curiosity slowly overcoming the mistrust that had clouded his interactions with her. One afternoon, as they walked through the estate's gardens, Alex surprised Helen with a question that caught her off guard. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his young eyes searching hers. Helen paused, choosing her words with care. "Because I was afraid," she replied, her voice laced with regret. "I thought I was doing what was best for your dad, but I see now that I was wrong, and I'm sorry, Alex, for everything." Her honesty seemed to put him at ease. He nodded, as if accepting her apology in his own quiet way. "Dad says we're supposed to forgive people when they're sorry," he said simply. Helen smiled, her heart swelling with hope. "Your dad's a wise man," she said, her voice soft. "And so are you." As Nolan worked to restore his company and repair his fractured family relationships, he found himself contemplating the future. While Jason's threat had been neutralized, the experience had shifted his priorities. He now understood the true importance of protecting what mattered most. No longer driven solely by ambition, he focused on building a life centered around love and connection. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Nolan made an announcement. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice calm yet filled with warmth, "about everything we've been through and everything we've built together, and I've decided it's time to make some changes." The boys looked at him with curiosity, and Jenny gave him a knowing smile, tilting her head slightly. "I'm stepping back from the day-to-day operations of the company," Nolan continued. "Claire will take on more of the responsibilities, and I'll still oversee the big decisions. But I want to spend more time with all of you." The boys cheered, their excitement evident, while Jenny's eyes shimmered with emotion. "That's a big step," Jenny remarked later, as they sat on the porch, gazing up at the night sky. Nolan nodded thoughtfully. "It is," he said, his tone contemplative, "but it feels right. I've spent so much of my life chasing success that I almost lost sight of what really matters. I'm not making that mistake again." This decision marked a pivotal moment for Nolan, a shift in his priorities that brought a sense of peace he had never known before. As the days passed, the family settled into a new rhythm, their bond growing stronger with every passing day. Jenny rediscovered her love for sewing, crafting beautiful garments that she began selling online. The project gave her a sense of purpose and independence, and Nolan couldn't have been prouder. But as the family moved forward, they couldn't ignore the loose ends still hanging in the air. Jason's trial loomed on the horizon, a final chapter in the drama that had consumed their lives. Nolan knew it would be a test, not just of their strength, but of their ability to truly leave the past behind. The chapter ended with Nolan and Jenny standing hand in hand on the porch, a quiet resolve settling between them. "Whatever happens next," Nolan said, his voice calm but full of determination, "we'll face it together." Jenny leaned into him, her heart full of hope for the future. "Together," she echoed. The day of Jason's trial finally arrived, marking the climax of months filled with struggles, revelations, and hard-won victories. Nolan sat in the courtroom, flanked by Claire and Carter, his face an unreadable mask as the trial unfolded. Across the room, Jason exuded defiance, his attorney weaving a web of corporate rivalry and personal vendettas, but the evidence weighed heavily against him. Every document, every witness painted an undeniable picture of Jason's greed and deceit. When Vincent Croft took the stand, the room grew eerily quiet. His testimony was the final blow to Jason's defense, exposing every shady deal and underhanded tactic Jason had used. Croft made it clear, Jason Blake hadn't just bent the rules, he had broken them time and time again, and didn't care who got hurt in the process. As the judge delivered the verdict, a wave of justice swept over Nolan. Jason was found guilty on multiple counts, his sentencing marking the definitive end of his reign of lies. Nolan let out a deep breath, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying, finally lifting. "It's over," he murmured to Claire, who gave him a small, content smile and nodded. "You did it," she said. "Now, go home to your family." At the Blake estate, Jenny had kept the boys busy, diverting their attention from the tension of the day. They were playing outside in the garden when Nolan arrived, and their eyes lit up the moment they saw him. The boys rushed to him, their faces full of excitement. "Did you win, Dad?" Caleb asked eagerly. Nolan knelt down to their level, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Yes," he replied simply. "We won." That evening the family gathered for a quiet celebration. Helen had joined them, and her interactions with the boys had become more natural and loving. She had worked hard to earn their trust, and Nolan began to see glimpses of the woman he had once known. Laughter filled the air during dinner, a stark contrast to the tension that had once consumed their lives. After the meal, Nolan took Jenny aside, his demeanor serious, yet gentle. "There's something I want to ask you," he said, his voice steady. Jenny tilted her head, curiosity flashing in her eyes. "What is it?" Nolan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Jenny gasped softly. "I've spent so much of my life chasing the wrong things," Nolan began, his voice thick with emotion. "But you, Jenny, you and the boys, you're everything I could ever need. I don't want to waste another moment. Will you marry me?" Tears welled up in Jenny's eyes as she nodded, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with joy. Nolan gently slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her close into a tight embrace as their boys cheered in the background. The wedding was a simple yet beautiful celebration, held in the estate's garden beneath a canopy of twinkling lights. Close friends and family gathered to witness Nolan and Jenny exchange vows, their love shining brighter than ever. Helen gave a heartfelt speech, acknowledging her past mistakes and expressing her gratitude for the second chance she had been given. Her words were met with applause and forgiveness, a symbolic healing of old wounds. As the ceremony drew to a close, Nolan took a quiet moment to reflect. The road to this point had been anything but easy, yet every struggle, every sacrifice had been worth it. He looked at Jenny, glowing in her wedding gown, and then at their boys, laughing and playing with the other children. For the first time in years, his heart felt whole. The days that followed were filled with hope and fresh starts. Nolan embraced his role as a hands-on father, spending time with the boys and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Jenny's business flourished, her designs gaining recognition and bringing her a sense of fulfillment. Together, they built a life overflowing with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future. The story ended one peaceful evening on the porch. Nolan and Jenny sat side by side, their hands intertwined as they watched the boys chase fireflies in the fading light. "We've come a long way," Nolan said softly, his gaze warm. Jenny nodded, her heart full. "And we've got so much ahead of us." As the stars began to sparkle above, the sound of the boys' laughter echoed through the night, a reminder of the strength of family, the power of love, and the beauty of second chances.